It was the spring of 1200 BCE. In the courtyard of the great temple of Amun at Karnak, on the banks of the Nile, stood a little girl, Nefertari. Around her were several priests, carefully shaving her head until not a single strand of hair was left. Nefertari was only 9 years old. 3 days earlier, her father, a low-ranking government official, had brought her to the temple. He was unable to repay an old debt owed to the temple, neither in grain nor in silver. And so, in desperation, he gave his daughter as payment. Nefertari had no idea what was happening to her. Her father had only told her that she was about to receive a great honor, that she had been chosen to serve the gods, and that she should feel proud and learn obedience. But when the cold bronze razor began scraping away her long, black braids, the ones she had always worn proudly, tears began to roll down her cheeks. A senior priestess stepped forward and struck her sharply across the face. "A servant of the gods does not cry," she said harshly. "You have no name now, no tears. You belong to Amun, and Amun does not tolerate weakness." That moment marked the beginning of Nefertari's new life, a life that would last 43 years in captivity and submission. She never left the temple again, never married, never owned anything, and never had control over her own body or her future. Her entire world was confined within walls, painted with images of gods and goddesses. Yet behind those divine murals lay silence, exploitation, and slavery. But Nefertari was not alone. In temples across Egypt, thousands of girls and women lived and died in the same way, wrapped in garments of purity, yet imprisoned within a system that stripped them of freedom. Their titles sounded holy and dignified: wife of the god, servant of the god, hand of the goddess, pure one. But behind these beautiful names was a reality that destroyed their lives. This is the truth most people never hear. The hieroglyphs, Egypt's sacred writings, do not tell their story. Yet their existence is recorded in papyri, in temple archives, and in ancient administrative records. This is the story of how religious authority was used to control women, to exploit their bodies and their devotion, all in the name of divine will. When we hear today about the temple virgins or wives of the god of ancient Egypt, we imagine graceful women in white linen performing sacred rituals with dignity and devotion. But that image is false, a product of ancient propaganda. The real truth is far darker. They were not divine servants, but victims of a carefully organized system of bondage. The most common title for them was Hemet, meaning servant of the god or god's wife. Other terms included Shemayet, singer, and Kenneret, temple attendant. Each had a specific role, but they all shared one cruel reality. None of them were free. This is the hidden truth behind the golden temples of Egypt. And if you truly wish to uncover the darkest corners of human history, stay with this story. Because what comes next is far darker than you could ever imagine. These women were tied to temple duties, rigidly regulated by its structure and deprived of independence and individuality. And concerning the term virgin, it didn't signify sexual purity as we perceive it currently. In temple terminology, purity signified ritual cleanliness, a condition characterized by the clergy. It indicated remaining unspoiled by the unrefined. However, this cleanliness was enforced through dominance, management of the physiques of the women, their motions, and their connections. They were maintained in their purity for the deities, which in practical terms signified they remained available to the priests who asserted they were the representatives of those deities. And this is the essential reality. The majority of these women never selected this existence. Numerous were offered to the temple as youngsters long before they were able to comprehend what it intended. Families would assign daughters as spiritual gifts, occasionally in order to obtain celestial approval, at other moments merely to nourish fewer individuals. What was shown as a demonstration of devotion was essentially a lasting capitulation. The girl received left and never returned. Some were provided as compensation for a loan. Similar to Nefertari, temples in Egypt were not merely places of worship. They were financially oriented, giants, possessing immense territories, providing grain and coins, along with gathering taxes. When families were unable to afford, they frequently compensated with their girls. It was a condition, approved human trafficking concealed in spiritual commitment. And afterward, there existed the girls who never had families to care for them, provide them, the ones received as tribute. Egyptian forces frequently seized individuals from Nubia, Libya, and the Levant. Included were young girls and women brought to temples and embraced into a framework of sacred duty from which escape was not feasible. The years of these girls were terrifyingly young. Documents inscribed on papyrus refer to beguines participating in temple service at only 8 or 9 years old, many years prior adolescence. They were kids unable to have permission. Allow me to share with you a story about one of a girl called Moya. She was 8 years old when soldiers from Egypt arrived to her village of Nubian heritage. They were gathering offering, metal, harvest, tusks, and kids. Among those selected was Mutua, a girl who is 8 years old. She, along with 12 others, were bound with ropes and compelled to advance northward, a trek extending hundreds of kilometers that continued for weeks. Mutuya was not fluent in Egyptian and was completely unaware of her destination. She wept endlessly until a guard hit her on the face and said to her tears were not allowed. Starting from that point, she discovered how to weep quietly. When she ultimately reached Thebes, she was designated for the Temple of Mut, the deity of motherhood. The harsh irony would only be revealed over time. She was now devoted to a goddess that represented mothers who are deprived of the right to eventually transform into one herself. The procedure that transformed kids such as Nefertari and Mutamuya into belongings of the temple was purposefully created to shatter them totally exhausted, both mentally and emotionally. A girl was admitted. Upon being deployed, she experienced a range of ceremonies aimed at shedding her history identity and transform her into obedient servant of the deities. The initial one was named purification via water. The kid was taken to a holy basin, unclothed, and cleansed continuously with water combined with natron, a mineral salt substance utilized in ceremonies. However, what was shown as purification was in actuality profoundly intrusive. These alleged cleansing baths were nothing beyond ceremonial tests concealed as sacred rituals. It seems like your text got cut off. Please provide the full text you would like me to paraphrase. Clergy examined every part of the girl's physique under the guise of making certain she was untainted. They asserted the ritual was holy and essential, and that any opposition would provoke the god's anger. When Nefertari was taken to a rock swimming pool, 3 clergymen and 2 elderly ladies were anticipating. She paused before taking off her garments, yet one of the ladies seized her and pulled them off. Water was ice cold. A single priest advanced into the pool next to her, instructing her to remain motionless. Gradually, he started to make contact with her in manners that caused her to shiver, experiencing unease. As she flinched, he gripped her by the arm and spoke curtly. "The deities are observing. They are conducting tests. Your compliance." Nefertari became motionless in fear and suffered in silence. That instant, veiled as a holy obligation, was her initial infraction. It established the atmosphere for the upcoming years, instructing her that the body was no longer hers. After the cleansing followed the shaving ceremony, each individual hair was taken out from her mind. It was stated officially to maintain ritual cleanliness, yet in reality, it helped to disrupt the girl's feeling of identity. Hair was connected to beauty, conceit, and self-importance. Eliminating it eliminated uniqueness. When Nefertari gazed at her image in a bronze reflection later, she was unable to identify the visage gazing back. That individual was no longer Nefertari. It was precisely what the temple had shaped her into. The ceremony involved a name change. Her given name, Theon, that her mother had given her, was taken away eternally. The priest designated her a different identity, typically resembling Cherished of Ammon or the goddess's hand. Nefertari received the new name Nefert Nebet. The lady is beautiful in meaning. She remained instructed not to reveal her real name once more. The name that linked her to her family was declared deceased, that the act of renaming signified the metaphorical demise of the child's previous self. She was no longer her father's daughter. She had been now an embodiment of the temple, a being sacrifice dedicated wholly to the deities. However, the procedure continued beyond that point. After the purging, trimming, and relabeling arrived the most ominous ceremony of all, the sacred union ritual. Every girl was symbolically wed to the deity she was meant to serve. The temple showcased this as a wonderful privilege. The youngster was clothed in elegant white linen, her shaved head adorned with a decorative wig, and her body decorated with ornaments. She was presented in front of the idol of the god, where she would pledge promises of everlasting service. Clerics chanted ceremonial phrases while if the deity itself were communicating through them. They welcomed the girl as the bride of God. When Muya experienced this ceremony, she was 10 years old, clothed in silken white fabric, her petite frame shining with golden decorations. She was guided into the inner sanctum, a dim hall overshadowed by the looming presence of the goddess Maat. The chief priest started to sing in the ancient holy language, stating it was the sound of Mother Self. He declared that Muya was selected, untainted, and favored to become the bride of the goddess. After that, he instructed her to affirm the vows. Surrender myself to Mut. My form is her shrine. My existence belongs to her. I shall serve in cleanliness and compliance eternally. She recited every statement without uncertainty, lacking comprehension of what they genuinely signified. That moment connected her to the temple for the remainder of her life. The priest documented it as a sacred partnership. However, in truth, it was a binding agreement of possession. A woman who was wed to deity could never wed a human. That route was shut down permanently. She was never able to have offspring who were acknowledged as genuine. She was tied to that institution until passing. However, there existed something more profound regarding this so-called sacred union. Something about the way the clergymen perceived their existence as vibrant envoys of the deities. And you will grasp what that signified before long. Life within the temple for thesis servants of the divine was created with complete accuracy, organized, separated, and managed to remove any opportunity for insurrection or flight. Let's experience a single day in the life of someone resembling Nefertitari. She used to awaken prior to dawn in a shared sleeping space, enclosed by numerous other youths females. The little girls rested beneath the oversight of senior staff members, female, who had devoted years within the framework and had forgotten what freedom was. Privacy was non-existent. The day started through cleansing ceremonies. Every woman cleaned herself, then put on simple white linen garments that identified her as one of the temple's estate. Then followed the labor assigned for the day, for the majority that entailed countless hours crafting fabric for the shrine, milling grain, getting ready services, or tidying refuges. Tedious tasks masked as sacred assistance. However, what rendered it intolerable was not solely the work, it was the quiet. The women were not allowed to talk, only when addressed. Any superfluous, the dialogue faced severe consequences. The quietness fractured human bonds, hindering friendship or trust. They were encircled by others, yet entirely by oneself. In Nefertari's lonely existence, her only true friend was a girl named Takayat. Every day, they worked side by side in the same chamber, their hands constantly busy spinning threads, weaving the sacred garments and veils of the temple. They were forbidden to speak, yet at rare moments they would dare to whisper softly, fleeting exchanges of humanity within walls of silence. One afternoon, as the sun scorched the courtyard, the overseer caught them whispering. Without warning, she raised her wooden stick and struck Takayat on the back of the neck with full force. The girl collapsed to the floor. The overseer immediately called for the guards and shouted, "This is what happens to those who break the silence." Takayat was dragged away. For Nefertari, that moment felt frozen in time. Silence fell again across the courtyard. But it was a silence filled with fear. For 3 days, Takayat did not return. When she finally came back, she was no longer the same. The life in her face had vanished. The light in her eyes was gone. She neither laughed nor spoke, nor did she meet anyone's gaze again. 2 months later, one morning, she disappeared, this time forever. The overseer made only one cold announcement before the others. Takayat has been declared impure. She has been returned to the gods. No one was told what that truly meant, but every woman knew returning to the gods was a metaphor for death. Inside the temple, surveillance was constant, both visible and unseen. The women were watched every moment, their movements strictly controlled. They could not contact their families, nor make choices of their own. Every part of their existence, from thought to breath, was monitored and restrained. In the name of purity, they were subjected to regular inspections. These examinations, conducted under the supervision of priests, were deeply invasive and humiliating. Nefertari soon learned to separate her mind from her body, to let her thoughts drift far away while her body endured those violations. Any sign of displeasure or resistance invited punishment. Sometimes it meant extra labor, sometimes food deprivation, and at worst, beatings. There was no escape. Most of the women had been brought to the temple as children, so young that they no longer remembered what life outside had ever felt like. They had no skills, No homes to return to, no memory of freedom. For them, the temple was the world, and they were its prisoners. They were bound not only by stone walls, but by mental chains as well. Everything they were taught, their prayers, their rituals, their words, was designed to instill obedience. They were constantly reminded that they were blessed, for the priests spoke with divine authority, and their bodies were temples of the gods. It all sounded sacred, until you realized how that idea was used against them. The faith that should have liberated them had become the very weapon of their enslavement. If the human body is seen as a temple, and the priests claim to be the representatives of the gods, then it is those very priests who begin to assert control over that temple. Mutamuya, a young girl from Nubia, was 16 years old, and she had already spent 8 long years serving in the temple. Yet somewhere deep within her heart, the scent of her homeland still lingered, the echo of her mother's lullabies, and the faint glow of her childhood memories. One night, when all others were asleep, she softly began to hum an old Nubian melody, perhaps to feel, just for a moment, like herself again. But her voice reached the ears of an older temple woman. By morning, Mutamuya was dragged before the high priest. Without a word, he struck her across the face. His eyes were cold, his tone venomous with authority. He said, "You have no mother. You have no tongue except the tongue of the gods. You have no memories except those we grant you." Those words struck Mutamuya like a thunderbolt. She was immediately locked inside a storage chamber for 7 long days. Inside, darkness, silence, and fear were her only companions. When she finally emerged, the light in her eyes was gone. Something inside her had died that could never return. From that day onward, she never sang again. But the story doesn't end there. It only grows darker. Among the temple women, a few were given a special title. They were called wives of the god. They participated in elaborate rituals recorded in inscriptions as sacred unions. These ceremonies were said to symbolize the divine marriages of the gods, holy unions meant to preserve the fertility and prosperity of Egypt. In the texts, these rituals were described with poetic grace, filled with metaphors, sacred imagery, and divine symbolism. But beneath those words lay a terrible truth. High-ranking priests, especially the high priest of Amun, claimed that during these ceremonies the god himself inhabited their bodies. They dressed in sacred garments, performed long and elaborate rites, and declared that every act they carried out was the will of the god made flesh. The women chosen for these rituals were told that they were to receive the god's blessing. They were taken into the innermost sanctuaries of the temple, warned that resistance would bring divine wrath, and that disobedience could doom all of Egypt. And then those same priests, invoking their so-called divine right, performed what they called the god's sacred union. But let there be no confusion. These were not holy ceremonies, nor spiritual experiences. They were acts of coercion, encounters where powerful men exerted control over powerless women who had been indoctrinated since childhood to believe that their existence, their souls, and their very bodies belonged not to themselves, but to the gods. When Nefertari was chosen for her first sacred union, she was only 14 years old. She was told that Amun himself would bless her that night as the temple's torches burned with a faint golden light. Nefertari was led into the innermost chamber of the temple, where behind the veil of holiness lay the darkest face of human cruelty. The air was laden with the scent of incense. The elevated clergyman, his visage concealed beneath a decorative mask, neared and directed her to submit fully. Nefertari did not grasp what he intended. She still dashed his hands extended to take her away attire. Then she realized and instinctively retreated. But the other clergyman comforted her, murmuring that this was the deity's desire. The priest cautioned her that turning him down would be blasphemy, an affront to Amun himself. What ensued was documented as a prosperous holy alliance. However, Nefertari understood the reality. It was not holy. It was breach cloaked in ceremonial assault master's faith. A few women were compelled to participate in these alleged unions frequently. Even more troubling, several of them gave birth to children. Those children were formally announced cursed. Still, they remained as irrefutable evidence of what had occurred to their moms. Daughters were brought up to serve the temples exactly like their mothers did. Sons were educated to become priests. The cycle maintained itself. At the age of 16, Nefertari understood she was expecting. she felt an emotional response to an alternative accommodation where different pregnant women resided. All of them individuals affected by the same system. An elderly, the woman gently advised her, "Don't hold on to hope too tightly. A lot. Once your child has been weaned, it will. If it's a female, she will serve, here similar to us. If it's a male, the clergyman will elevate him. You will continue to belong to the temple, just like your child will." Nefertari had a baby girl. Sure, please provide the text you would like me to paraphrase. 3 short years, she looked after her youngster. Then the girl was removed to start her own training. Nefertari returned to her responsibilities, noticing her daughter seen only from a distance in the temple halls, always forbidden to talk, never permitted to recognize her. Observing her small child withstand the same shattering procedure she had previously endured was the most severe punishment of all. Currently, what occurred to those who challenged the status quo was intended to instill fear in everyone else. A few women endured what the documents refer to commitment to the desert. They were pulled outside the temple boundaries and abandoned isolated beneath the scorching sun, lacking nourishment or liquid. Exposure-induced death, gradual and agonizing. One of those women was Canutma. Elevation. While having lunch, she suddenly stood up and yelled, "This is not sacred. These individuals are not deities. We are inmates." The whole hall became quiet. Renutma was captured immediately and transported outdoors. Each woman in the temple was compelled to observe as she was taken into the wasteland and forsaken. The following morning, they were taken to observe what was left of her body, already partially consumed by untamed creatures. The chief priest announced, "This is the destiny of the unclean." However, Renutma's rebellion created a different form of heritage. It showed the others that rebellion needed to be quiet and unnoticeable. Opposition persisted in covert messages concealed in music, in quick looks shared during worship, or through minor gestures of resistance, such as intentional weaving mistakes that formed soft phrases like, "I refuse." A majority of the women of the temple perished inside those walls, dedicating whole lifetimes to mandatory service. When they passed away, they were interred in nameless collective graves, their names removed from recollection. Nefertari passed away at 52. Her remains were arranged in a hole next to 3 other females. No casket, no burial rituals. Her child, now matured and fulfilling the same institution, was not allowed to grieve. The request was straightforward. Disregard that she ever was present. Still, a few of them declined to vanish completely. In concealed spaces, upon pieces of rock, they inscribed brief communications. "I came into this world free. They seized that from me. Recall that we were individuals." And there stood Mutamuya, the Nubian female. 2 days prior to her passing, she carved her last message into the wall from a shadowy room. "I arrived from afar, the initial waterfall. The name of my mother was Manatori. I can still hear her voice. Never lost sight of who I was before they took myself. This existence was not chosen by me. If you discover this, understand that I existed. Be aware that I recalled." Her words continue to echo from the rock. "I was present. I was significant. Recall my presence." This is the reality. Egyptian temples aimed to conceal. Countless young girls captured during childhood. Exploited for years, wiped out in death. Currently, guests are amazed by these temples' elegance, appreciating their columns and engravings, seldom acknowledging the paint that developed inside them. When you look at those ancient walls again, your perspective will no longer be the same. Behind the radiant images of gods and pharaohs were the women, Nefertari, Mutamuya, and countless others whose names have been lost to the dust of time. They were real human beings. Women who endured inhuman cruelty and still carved out some form of resistance, even if it was nothing more than a faint scratch on stone. How do you think their story should be remembered? How should history treat these monuments of suffering? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe these forgotten voices deserve to reach the world, then subscribe to this channel. Here, we bring forward the stories that power has always tried to silence. The temples still stand. The stones still bear witness. And now, you too stand as a witness to this truth.